The year is 2020. The world has shut down. But on one particular Monday in April, the world's most powerful commodity, oil, plunged to a price below zero. To understand how that happened, you have to meet a young woman in China who was about to lose everything and more. A 26-year-old named Chen and her partner, living in Shenzhen, China, had sunk their life savings, about $10,000, into a local bank's financial product called crude oil treasure. They'd seen advertisements with golden barrels of oil and thought they were making a smart investment. But on the morning of April 20th, 2020, things took a turn. The price of their investment was plummeting. With half their money gone, Chen checked her phone one last time before going to bed. The price of oil was sitting at just $11 a barrel. She prepared for the worst, but she was about to wake up to something far beyond her worst nightmares. The price kept falling. It went below zero. At one point, the price of a single barrel of oil wasn't just nothing. It was negative $37. That meant you had to pay someone almost $40 to take a barrel of oil off your hands. It was a crazy moment. How did an asset once known as black gold suddenly became a liability? And what did this mean for Chen and her $10,000 nest egg? To understand the forces at play, we have to go back in time just a little to see how the world got into this mess in the first place. This crazy story didn't start on that Monday morning. It began months before because of geopolitical moves by major oil-producing countries and the pandemic causing oil demand to plummet. In 2020, Russia and Saudi Arabia got into a price war over oil. Russia's main goal was to put American shale oil companies out of business because it felt they were profiting unfairly from high prices. Russia believed it could win this standoff because its economy was more prepared for low prices. It didn't need oil prices to be as high as Saudi Arabia did to cover its government spending. In the end, there was an excess of oil with low demand that caused prices to go low. The world was suddenly using so much less oil that it was like the entire consumption of India and the whole of Africa just disappeared. In a single 3-month period, global oil demand dropped by about 23 million barrels a day. That's the equivalent of all the oil by the US and Canada combined, every single day. This is important because all that extra oil had to go somewhere. The world was pumping millions of barrels, more than it was using, and there was a fear that we would simply run out of places to put it. In the world of oil trading, a key concept is the futures contract. A futures contract is an agreement to buy or sell a specific amount of a commodity, like 1,000 barrels of oil, at a certain price on a certain date in the future. The crucial part is that when the contract expires, you have to either sell it to someone else or take physical delivery of the oil. This isn't just an abstract idea. It means a tanker truck full of 1,000 barrels of crude oil will be delivered to you. And this is where a small town in Oklahoma comes into the picture. The benchmark for American oil is called West Texas Intermediate, or WTI. Its main storage hub is in Cushing, Oklahoma. Cushing is basically the oil market's bank vault, with dozens of massive storage tanks holding millions of barrels of crude. As the world ground to a halt, these tanks started to fill up at an alarming rate. They were designed to handle a certain capacity, but no one imagined a scenario where demand would completely disappear while supply kept flowing. The tanks were getting so full that there was a real concern there would be nowhere left to put the oil. As the oil market descended into chaos, a crucial deadline was approaching: the expiry of the May West Texas Intermediate futures contract. Most large investors and traders had already gotten out of their May contracts and moved into the June contracts. But for a group of unsuspecting people around the world, this wasn't the case, and their losses were about to get a whole lot worse. By the time Monday, April 20th rolled around, most professional investors had already gotten out of their May contracts, but the problem remained: who would buy the remaining contracts that were about to expire? The people who were holding them needed to get rid of them, and fast. The problem was there were no buyers. Much of the market was focused on a specific time, 2:30 p.m. in New York, when the settlement price for the contracts would be determined. Investment funds like the Bank of China's crude oil treasury often relied on trading at settlement contracts to finalize their prices. This mechanism allows traders to buy or sell contracts ahead of time for whatever the final settlement price turns out to be. On this day, however, that mechanism failed. From 1:12 p.m. until 2:17 p.m., trading in these contracts completely dried up. There were no buyers. The sellers, facing the very real possibility of being handed thousands of barrels of unwanted crude oil that they had nowhere to put, panicked. With no one to sell to, they started paying people to take the contracts off their hands. The price of West Texas Intermediate turned negative at 2:08 p.m. and then minutes later sank to an astonishing negative $40 before slightly rebounding. The negative prices weren't just on the trading screen, they were happening to physical barrels of oil across the US. In North Dakota, Bakken crude was trading at an unprecedented negative $37 a barrel, matching the futures price. And in Texas and Oklahoma, pipeline companies began posting prices as low as negative $55 a barrel. In a 20-minute period, traders were speechless, and it left the financial world with a question that still hasn't been fully answered. Back in China, Chen and her partner weren't the only ones in trouble. About 3,700 other small-time investors had poured their money into the Bank of China's crude oil treasury fund. They hadn't understood the fine print of what they were getting into, especially the idea of contract rolling. They hadn't realized that the fund was holding onto the very contracts that were about to expire, meaning they were at risk of physical delivery of oil barrels. They also didn't realize that their bet on oil could cost them more than just their initial investment. The bank had told them that the product was risk-free because investors had to put up the full cost of what they were buying in advance. But no one had considered what would happen if the price of oil went below zero. At that point, the money they had put up wasn't enough to cover the loss. Not only had Chen lost her entire savings, but they were now being told they owed the bank money. They were getting a text message at 6 in the morning informing them they may actually have to pay. In essence, what happened in the Bank of China was that the money the investors had put in initially, about $28 million, was completely wiped out when the price of oil hit zero. But the losses didn't stop there. As the price plunged into negative territory, something even worse happened. The investors now owed the bank an additional amount of money, to the tune of about $56 million. The total financial damage to the bank's clients was a combination of their initial loss and this new debt, which added up to about $84 million in total. And this wasn't just a Chinese problem. The dated Brent benchmark, a global reference for nearly two-thirds of the world's oil, also plunged to its lowest point since 1999. Prices for actual barrels of crude oil in Europe, Africa, and Asia were trading for as little as $5 a barrel. For a country like Nigeria, which needs about $133 a barrel to break even, this was a disaster. The reason was the same. Storage tanks around the world were filling up rapidly with unwanted oil. While professional traders were getting out of the market, retail investors around the world were piling in. On one popular trading platform, the number of users buying the biggest US oil fund, the United States Oil Fund, or USO, more than doubled in just a few days. These investors were convinced that with prices so low, they had nowhere to go but up. But these investors were making a huge mistake. What they didn't understand was that the USO fund's price didn't perfectly follow the price of oil. The fund had a major and expensive problem. It had to constantly roll its futures contracts. This means it had to sell off its contracts that were about to expire and buy new, more expensive ones for the next month. The expensive and ongoing process was called a super contango, and it was bleeding money from the fund. After the negative price crash, some investment funds ended up holding a lot of oil contracts, making them major players in the market. Under pressure to get rid of their June contracts, two popular funds, including the USO, sold a huge amount, 110,000 contracts in a single day. This massive sell-off caused the price of the June oil contract to drop by up to 30% in late April 2020. To make things worse, the USO fund's share price, which had started the year around $13 per share, had fallen so low, hitting roughly $3 per share, wiping out the savings and investments of millions of people. This low price also put it in danger of being removed from the stock exchange. To avoid this, the fund did something called a reverse stock split, which essentially combined several shares into one more expensive-looking share. It was a clever move to make the fund seem more valuable and not be delisted. In the end, just like the investors in China, these global traders were burned by a market they didn't fully understand. In the chaotic aftermath, several brokerages, including some of the largest, began restricting clients from entering new trades in the most active oil contracts. They said the move was to curb losses and protect their customers from the extreme and unpredictable volatility. The consequences were real. One brokerage, Interactive Brokers, reported its clients suffered an aggregate loss of $88 million. In the case of Bank of China, the backlash was immediate. Hundreds of angry investors flooded the internet to protest the bank's handling of the situation. Videos of a protest outside Bank of China's offices circulated, while photographs showed customers in Shanghai mailing written complaints to the banking regulator. In the wake of this turmoil, other major Chinese banks also began to halt sales of similar oil-linked products for individuals. The incident also highlighted the risk of many financial products that are easily accessible by non-professionals, and the global shockwave was felt from South Korea to India, where retail investors and brokerages were also grappling with millions of dollars in losses from the negative prices. Amid all this chaos, the world's top oil producers came together for a historic deal to slash production. The OPEC alliance, which includes countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia, agreed to cut 9.7 million barrels of oil a day. This agreement was the result of a week-long marathon of negotiations that almost fell apart and required President Donald Trump to step in and help broker the final deal. But even with this unprecedented cut, many analysts said it was too little and too late. The cuts of 9.7 million barrels were simply not big enough to offset the massive drop in demand, which according to some experts had plummeted by as much as 20 million barrels a day. A major problem was one of timing. The cuts were announced in April, but they wouldn't begin until May. This meant that for several more weeks, producers like Saudi Arabia were still pumping millions of barrels, more than the world was using. In fact, Saudi Arabia's crude exports in the first 2 weeks of April were nearly 40% higher than they were in March. The market was so overwhelmed that prices for crude oil in places like the North Sea were in a freefall, trading at their biggest discount in almost a decade. The 2020 oil crash was a perfect storm. A global shutdown meant nobody needed oil, but we kept pumping it. This created a massive storage problem that led to a moment where you actually had to pay people to take oil off your hands. It was a harsh lesson for everyday investors worldwide who found out the hard way that even a simple bet on black gold could turn into a financial nightmare.
Want more videos that explain what's really going on in the world of business? Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you're always in the loop. Thanks again for showing love on our last video, and our favorite comment from that one goes to